Hello and welcome to In the Art Scene podcast, a place where creatives share their stories. My name is Galina Marquez, and I have another cool story prepared for you today, so let's get to it. Hello everybody to the next episode of In the Art Scene podcast, and I am having a special guest today, which I actually have a special guest every single time, but today it's very special to me personally because we're going to talk about a very influential woman artist that I myself got to learn about 2-3 years ago, and I was blown away. And I hope everyone is going to be blown away. So we're talking today with Nellie Scott, who is a director. Is that correct? Director of Corita Art Center in Los Angeles. And who is Corita? If you guys don't know, and I suspect a lot of you don't know, well, brace yourself. Just buckle up. That's going to be awesome. All right. Hello, Nellie. Good morning. Tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into Corita's story.
Absolutely. Well, good morning, and thank you so much for having me on. And I feel so lucky to be Corita's champion, so very enthusiastically engaged to always tell her story and to share about the work that we do at the Corita Art Center. So my name is Nellie Scott, and I am the director at the Corita Art Center. My background actually isn't in printmaking, so I think that usually surprises some individuals. I studied art history, specifically Indigenous, contemporary art, and social practice art. So that usually is a kind of an interesting way to approach her work when you think of her, when we dive in about her conceptual practice and her community engagement. That's one of the reasons I was drawn to her legacy was what does it look like to create art in collective community?
So you have, what is it? BFA, MFA in the art history?
Yeah,
Awesome.
my undergrad, I went to Portland State University. I also studied at Szeged University in Hungary for some time. And then, my own background, I worked in New York for a long time as an art advisor and consulting, a little more on the commercial side of the art world. And found my way back to the West Coast happily. I currently was actually recently placed on the board at USC Brodsky School of Art and Design, and which we'll talk about is actually Corita's alma mater. So that feels very kismet.
Well, I can tell by your face that you're very passionate about it.
Yes.
Very passionate. And I can attest because so back in 2019, I was creating a series of influential women, and there was like, I made a few portraits, and they were very symbolic kind of looking, and I was looking for the next woman to portray, and at the same time, it was a project for our local nonprofit organization here in San Diego. They're working with schools, specifically Title I schools, who are cutting off art programs. And when I suggested Corita as a subject for the auction, for the piece that I was going to create for their auction, they said it's awesome because she's an educator and she's a great woman artist. And then I started digging deeper, and I am now a biggest fan of Corita, although printmaking is not necessarily something that I would attempt myself. Like, I'm not doing that. And her art is very, very conceptual. But her personality and the legacy is something that is like, it stuck with me for the rest of my life. I can tell. And what kind of, I don't know, upsets me a little bit is that she was in her time, which was not that far long ago, right? It was 60s, 70s. She was a very prominent, very famous, like nationally famous figure, right? And right now, ask anyone And I barely know, well, I have one friend who's 95 years old.
Yeah.
Uh, those who listen to the podcast, they remember the episode with B Gold. She's 95 years old. She's a working artist. She knows who Corita is. She lived in Los Angeles. She like witnessed a lot of those things. But like my generation and all the emerging artists that I'm talking to right now, they have no idea, and it's saddening. So tell us a little bit about who actually was
Yeah, well,
Corita.
I'm always excited to talk about Corita, and to, of course, soapbox to perhaps why she's maybe still somewhat considered an outlier. Although I do think that that's very much changing, like many women artists. But so she was born in Fort Dodge, Iowa in 1918. Her family, was working, we would say working poor family, but you also have to think of the time period of what was going on nationally here in the US. But they moved to Hollywood because her mother's family was out here. And so her and her siblings would often help out her parents, whether it's her mother taking in laundry, helping with your siblings, the same way so many big families were at this time. But what makes her story so, I think, fascinating when we're able to kind of unpeel so many of these historical layers is Corita was always an artist. There, even in her younger years, and she was also very familiar of this order, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which was located on, if you're familiar with Los Angeles, the corner of Western and Franklin. So very close now, where we're currently located still, it's very close to Griffith Park, if that helps with people locating where she was exactly.
Yeah. And I wanted to just make a note that Hollywood back then, when Corita's family moved to Los Angeles, was not the same Hollywood that it is now.
No, no, actually, Hollywood has an incredible history. There's a group called Hollywood Heritage that does a lot of amazing historical work. And, at one point, there was a lot of gender parity too, especially in the 20s and 30s. Hollywood, a lot of the properties were actually owned by women. Again, very unique. But Corita actually, again, was always an artist. She was mentored very much at a young age by Sister Naomi, who was an IHM, who would not keep Corita, but allow Corita to just stay late and teach her what she was learning while she was going through her undergrad. And then Corita surprised everybody at the age of 18 when she announced that she would be joining the Immaculate Heart of Mary Order, which her older sister was already a part of. And we always kind of step back and think, well, as a woman of this time period, this was really one of the only options she would have had to continue her education and her, being able to continue her art practice to some degree, or at least explore that for her life. And what made this order so unique against other orders, for example, was they were a pontifical order, and they ran the Immaculate Heart College, which was a women's college that you had to have your master's or higher to teach. That wasn't always the case. So they very much valued education. So Corita received her undergrad there, and then actually got she went to USC, and like I mentioned earlier, for her art history degree. And you can very much see Byzantine art inspiration in her early 50s. But she actually doesn't start printmaking until that time period. She sends as she's like exiting graduate school, she sends away for a do-it-yourself printmaking kit, which feels very Corita. And there's these great stories of her going into the bathroom at USC and like pulling from the paper towels. And, you don't need expensive materials to make art. right? And she credits another woman artist to really teaching her the mechanics of that. And then, from there, her career truly just starts to take off. But when we look at her within the canon of other pop artists and kind of art historical figures of this time, what makes her so unique is that this was in many ways an act of faith. She used her time and talents as her way of contributing to not only her community, but also the larger order. And she has quite a bit of success in doing that, right? And we can, of course, talk a little bit more about where that leads in her social justice efforts, where that leads into many of her conversations and cross-pollinations with many artists of this time period. I like to call it the 7 degrees of Corita.
That's funny. So yeah, we're talking about around 60s, right? 1960s. And Corita is pretty much a part of the pop art movement, right? So her, if you look at her prints, they very much resemble, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to compare her to Andy Warhol of the world, but it is obviously bold colors, geometric shapes. She was working with fonts and everything, and she did become successful. And then the next step, when did she become a head of the art department in the Immaculate Heart College?
Yeah, so she actually became the head of the art department in 1964. We would consider there's many reasons why she leans into pop art, frankly. Not only are things shifting within the art world, I think people sometimes come to her legacy as though she was working in a silo, but she wasn't. She was very informed by, like any of the other artists of the time period. We know she likely saw the Duchamp show at the Pasadena, the retrospective, the same as many of the male pop artists that we all, are household names, and was greatly inspired by that and just the contemporary scene. She would take her students out across. So she was very much aware of what was happening in the art world. But I think the thing that makes Corita so unique when we talk about her pop art kind of period of her work, is Vatican II was also occurring at the same time. So for anybody who's not, up on Catholic history, which is totally okay, because I'm continually learning myself, is Vatican II really shifted quite a bit, specifically for this order, because they took it very much to heart. What does it mean to show up for our neighbor in service? What does it mean to speak the native language when giving Mass? So no longer doing Mass in Latin, but many other kind of spiritual explorations were happening at this time, which go hand in hand very much so with pop art and the pop art movement. When you think of, how do we take something really commercial and kind of flip it on its on its side? And for Corita, she was doing that, but also appropriating message. So when she creates Wonder Bread and there's these 12, floating, kind of wonder balls from the packaging, those are, if you were a person of faith, that's the Eucharist. Those are the 12 apostles. There's so much more to her work in that respect. It really comes back to the message of you don't need an invitation to participate in her work, regardless of your faith. And certainly her social advocacy, we could talk about that for days, really. But also what's happening at this time period, that she becomes the head of the art department in 64, but in around 62 at the same time, a grocery store opens up across the street from the mother house and the college, the Market Basket. So she's taking her students in to the grocery store to do these looking exercises with a tool called a viewfinder.
Well, that's an interesting exercise, by the way, and I love that. If you tell a little bit about that to our listeners who doesn't know like what the finder is and how they did this exercise, because I think to me it's an amazing field work with the students, and it's an amazing message of how to find inspiration and the beauty in the world if you dissect it into the little sections, because we can see a big object and it can be ugly, but within that big ugly object, I mean, that's what I got from that lesson for myself. But maybe I'm missing something.
We often describe, because we have young visitors, pre-pandemic, we had school groups that would come in, and we would jokingly call it, analog Instagram, because it's essentially a small square that's been cut out of a cardstock or postcard or 35 millimeter slide. You could, just punch the slide part right out and use it as a looking tool in teaching your eye to isolate images, very similar to photography, which was a huge part of Corita's practice. We have over 15,000 35 millimeter slides of Corita's that we're currently digitizing actually at the moment. But she would take her students on these long walks, and she was notorious for giving some hefty assignments, to say the least. But the kind of conceptual practice of the viewfinder is that sometimes it's really difficult to take in the whole, right? Even now when we're watching the news, it's really hard to take in the whole. And so in the process of really looking and teaching ourselves to relook, and how we're viewing something that we might walk by every day and not appreciate, it really helps you ground you and find gratitude also in the square foot you're standing in, so that you can better be a tool for change. In many ways, if you think of the ripple effect of change, of education, of all of these things, sometimes you really have to start small in order to have that big whole moment. And so when she took her students on these walks, it was about teaching them to look again and then look again. And so that was very much part of her art assignments. She would say, do 100 drawings by tomorrow. And that could be the corner of your elbow if you want, but
I quit.
Yeah. Notorious for both being a loving leader, but also she very clearly had a larger objective with how she was teaching her students.
And that was also very interesting to learn from me, because even from reading about her and her biography, I have watched a couple of interviews, and in the interviews, she actually appears to be a very, very soft and very loving person. But in reading about her, there is that image of a very, very strong personality. She was a strong person as a teacher, as an artist, as an opinionated citizen, and at the same time, so she would be that. I don't even know what word to assign to her, like a very confident mother that would lead you by the hand in a certain direction, but at the same time not pushing you and not violating you, doing it with the whole heart. So she was a very strict teacher, but at the same time, she was a very loving teacher. So she would open the world to her students, but she would not let them slip through the cracks, and they would have to do 100 drawings overnight.
I think the only people that can really speak to her in that respect are her students. But when we think of her greatest legacy, it is her students, right? I think we all have a teacher in our lives that we can instantly think of who changed maybe the course of our own lives, of like, finding inspiration and encouragement and empowerment. But that's the role of an educator. That's when you have a good educator, the ripple effects into this world. So when we think of her legacy, it often comes to her students. It's something that we are so rich in. And so if we feel a lot of gratitude at the Corita Art Center to still have her students. And, most recently, I'm sure you were following with her studio space and us working to save it and have it receive historical cultural monument status, which is, a large undertaking. It was really her students too that came to the forefront and said, I remember this space. I know what happened to this space. I made work in this space. This space matters to the larger history of Los Angeles. And so for that reason, again, we're so lucky to have them. They've gone off and done incredible things in their lives. And they also very much cherish Corita and thinking of how do we pass that torch to the next generation, these incredible lessons. We are very rich with her pedagogy. We think of a lot about art education and what's the foundation of art education now. If there are art educators listening, her book that she had done with Jan Stewart called Learning by Heart. Wow. I personally felt so lucky to bring that home during the pandemic, because it does feel like it was written during a pandemic, because so much of the exercises are very accessible and have us rethink, relook, and create with being able to experiment. It goes back to her 10 rules of you don't have to creating and analyzing are two different processes.
Yeah, and I wanted to make a comment, and I wanted to ask you a question. So I start with a comment about the center. For those who doesn't know, I believe it's a small building of a laundromat.
Her studio, yes, it was a dry cleaner. It's currently empty at this very moment. This was an annex to the college. So it was directly across from the street where we were directly across the street from her studio. That's where we're located.
Yeah, I was following the whole thing during the pandemic. I believe, by the lobby of developers, the space was supposed to be cleared and for some kind of other building, right? Because it's the old laundromat or dry cleaners, blah, blah, blah. It's not pretty, but it does make a difference for people who remember this space. And there's a huge history with that. And again, I shared that information with the artist I mentioned earlier today, B. Gold, who used to live in Silver Lake, and she happened to know Eric Garcetti personally. So I believe she actually wrote him a letter.
Great. Well, please tell her thank you. When we learned it was slated to be demolished for parking spaces, which is a very Los Angeles story. And that's, that happens kind of time and time again in Los Angeles when we think we're a city of new, we're always thinking forward. And what felt really important in this process to raise our hand, to say, hey, something really important happened here. But when we found out that it was only 3% of historical sites that were associated with women's heritage in the city of Los Angeles, we felt it was very important to raise our hand, and how close those are to actually national numbers of historical monuments associated with women or women's heritage, specifically women artists and their work. It felt really important that this is a space. It's not necessarily pretty. It's something you would walk by every day and probably not think twice about. But extraordinary things happen in ordinary spaces. You artists don't need marble walls for something to create incredible work. And I think the pandemic actually taught us that. You can, how many artists moved their studio into their garage to be able to do what they needed to do. And that this site represents so much more for the city of Los Angeles. What does a space look like in remembering all of these shared ethos around love, hope, and justice. That certainly feels pretty important to rally around, that this is a space, again, where extraordinary things happen, but further, where collective community comes together. It wasn't just Corita in this building, of course. And so we were very excited. We received historical designation thanks to many people who wrote in, who called, who said, this is important to us too. Please don't make parking spaces. And again, we feel very fortunate to have so many people in our universe that felt that moment with us and shared that moment with us.
Yeah, I think it's a very much a big part of Corita's legacy too. Let's take a short coffee break. Are you enjoying this episode? If you do, would you buy me a coffee? I would really appreciate it. The link is in the show notes and on our website, intheartscene.com. Thank you for your support. Speaking about the legacy, I actually have on my board at my studio the 10 rules of being an art teacher. And that was something that she created. And I think it's being confused because there was, I think, the number 10 or it was an later addition by another person, which I totally am blanking right now. I'm sorry. Yeah. you will save me in this situation.
I was going to say the 10 rules. If you don't have them hanging in your house, boy, do you need a copy of them, because I know that we look to them often just as staff in the work that we're doing. And my favorite rule, or the part of the rules that I really enjoy, is that there will be new rules next week, because it reminds us all to be very flexible with each other and ourselves. So the 10 rules that were part of the Immaculate Heart College, as I understand it, were essentially curated by Corita, but they were done in the classroom with her students of, what does it mean to be a good student? What does it mean to be a good teacher? And those were put together. And one of her students, Barbara Loest, actually did the kind of essentially the first version. And the one that's most well-known, the David Meckelberg, he had done the typeface and the laid down. Yes, that's David Meckelberg, the one that I think most people recognize, or that's been more widely populated. But like anything from this time period, it's not about that sense of ownership, right? So this was well sent out into the world. We know that there's the version that hung in Merce Cunningham's studio. We know it has a John Cage quote in it. So I think that there was maybe possibly some confusion along the way. But all that said, that's not what it's about. It's about here are these 10 pillars of concepts that we should look to think of the creative process. And so each artist has kind of interpreted this their own way. It speaks to them differently. Sometimes one rule will stand out to you, and the others you'll kind of blow past when you read them. And so we feel very lucky to have those in our life, again, hanging in our offices to look to, mostly that consider everything an experiment, because the last 2 years has really taught us to be flexible, and that we might get this wrong, but we also might get it right. So let's try.
Yeah, that's true. Let's talk a little bit about Corita's social justice work.
Yes, certainly. I think that again is something that we could talk on for days. And something that she's really widely attributed as a social justice advocate. I think it's important that she she's placed, she never marched herself, but she used her art as her tool and where she spent her time. And often thinking around, how do you change a system from within a system? We could probably go on about the larger conflicts with this order and the LA Archdiocese and Cardinal McIntyre, kind of a lightning rod there. And there's actually a documentary that came out called Rebel Hearts that's on Discovery Plus that really does a good job of telling a complicated story there. And Corita is featured as well, along with some of the other amazing leaders like Helen Kelly and Anita Caspary. But with her social justice work, I think we see a pretty big turning point of where in 1965, she creates My People, which is a work that includes or appropriates the cover of LA Times. And it's following the Watts uprising, and she turns it on its side and she includes this big swash of red and words from a sermon from a priest that had been marching in Selma at that time in Alabama. And the kind of historical background too there of the context of what was happening here in Los Angeles with the LA Archdiocese was actually really similar to what was happening with the Alabama Archdiocese and what they were, kind of calling for people to faith to do and or not do. And I think that's really some of a turning point that we see in her work, where it's as if she's reporting the news. There's always more to her work than what you see. So if you want to spend an hour with a piece and just take it all in, you certainly can. If you want to take the Beatles lyrics and think of what are all the meanings of this language, we see her turn to language and typeface almost as if it's subject matter. Like a still life, you would have a bowl of fruit. She's using language and all of the meanings around that. Ultimately, Corita goes on sabbatical in 1967, and in 1968 seeks dispensation from her vows. And the rest of her life, she works as a secular artist. And she was active, until her death in 1986. It was always about humanitarian efforts for her. It's always about the greater whole. And, anti-war, anti-nuclear war specifically. So she was equally giving with her work too. She often commissions, as a secular artist, because she's got bills to pay, right? Like any artist, like she's got to be able to buy groceries and take care of herself. So she takes on a lot of different commissions, but we see a kind of a balancing out where she's very giving with her work with causes she cares about. So there's many nonprofits and other movements that she is attributed to in giving her work or illustrating her work in some cases. And that list is very long, very, very long. I think you could go onto our website, corita.org. You can see some of them, but there's certainly quite a bit of room to research around her commissions because you can see her heart, where her heart lives in her work. And most recently, with the current news, we've been thinking very much on her peace project that she had done, which says we can create life without war. And a billboard that comes out in 1985, right before she passes, where she says it's her most religious work to date, is this billboard that she creates, calling for peace.
Yeah, and for the reference, we are recording this interview on March 1st. And we are really very much in the midst of the conflict that's happening right now in Ukraine, and the whole world is in distress and devastated and standing with Ukrainian people. And yeah, and I think that that's a very appropriate moment to remember that specific work of Corita, because she was very much about peace. And what you said about that you can sit with your work for an hour and study it, it's actually true, which is like, to me, it's very interesting, because when you glance at it, it's, her work is very graphical. There's big shapes, chunks of text. So if you just glance and move on, you might not find anything in it, because it looks very minimalistic, simplistic. But if you stop and think about, first of all, like, read into those little quotes that she was including, or think about why she turned the text, on its side or upside down, or it does create a certain meaning to what she was trying to convey, and it really takes a little bit of attention and a little bit of time to really understand what she was trying to say. It's much deeper than it looks, well, from the first glance, for sure.
Yeah. And nothing's by accident when it comes to Corita.
Yeah.
I will say that.
And it's interesting you mentioned that she never marched herself, because I believe I have seen photos of her and like in a group of people with placards and stuff. So I thought that she was.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think there's these beautiful photos of Mary's Day and these processions. There's the nun with the guitar. Like, it doesn't get more 60s than the flowers in their hair, this prototype for what we think of the 1960s social movements. But when Corita was made the head of the art department there at Immaculate Heart College, she was tasked with kind of sprucing up the Mary's Day celebration. And while it looks like a protest, it was not. It was a celebration and a procession that centered world hunger. The idea being, like, what does it mean to come together in celebration and center world issues? What does it mean to come together for change and in joy, right? If we can join hand in hand in joy and center these issues and really talk about them, what change could be possible? And so it very much looks as though
it does.
It does. And the signage, right? They're appropriating, they're going into the market basket. I would have loved to have been an employee at the market basket, of like nuns and students coming in and out all the time, taking old packaging and they're making signage out of it. But again, they're really centering world hunger here and poverty, and thinking through what is our individual action to the collective whole. And if we can come together in this to create change. So that's that Mary's Day, that 1964 Mary's Day. Those images are really strong and beautiful. And gosh, I would have paid anything to be there for that event. There was music, there was laughter, there's flowers in their hair. They're really almost as if it's a happening in many ways, what we would call a happening now. But she really comes back down to, especially in some of her Heroes and Sheroes series, where these things just kind of bubble out of her, very much so. There's a piece called The Passion for the Possible that is, one I like to speak on, and always when there is a tour of people stop on and spend some time with, because what she calls to action in the viewer and her larger community, in her work, which does feel very social, like the social justice component of all of this, is that, hope is not optimism. It's hard work, and we have to show up to make hope. It's not something that you just can take for granted. And people who are creating and making, they're making hope in that process. It's for a brighter future. And in the last few years, I think that we really have to sit back and say, like, let's look to see what the artists are doing. How are the artists the importance of art and culture in all of our lives for our mental wellness, for dialogue, for unpacking hard things, to talk about hard things. Let's look to the artists for this. And I think in many ways, we can also look back to Corita for some of this, and to see her work in many of the contemporary shows in the last few years, hanging side by side these current working artists. It's pretty impactful to see how much has changed and how much has not changed in this discourse.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like we're having given the current news, we're having a very appropriate conversation.
Yeah.
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 Hopefully that by the time this episode is on air, things will have resolved in the most positive way, because the whole world is hoping right now. And I think it is very important to remember the lessons that Corita was trying to convey to us about how to get together to make a positive change. And right now is really not the time to stand against one another, or throw the blame at each other. It is really a very communal process of making this situation go to a very peaceful end. I was going to ask you, because that part of Corita, like the last years of Corita's life, is something that I have not studied very well. I know that she was diagnosed with cancer, but I know very little about her last years. So if you talk a little bit about that, I would really appreciate that.
Yeah. Oh, well, you're correct. She does get cancer in the 70s, and you can see it in many ways when you look at all of her work. You can see this kind of introspective moments happening, these larger explorations. I think, she was nicknamed the joyful revolutionary. And I don't know many artists that so have put upon them that they have to be happy all of the time. And Corita was pretty open in interviews of like, while they're brightly colored, like, read the text too, that, she's a full-rounded human, very much so, in processing her cancer and what's happening at that time in the world. And she does, the cancer does return. And some of her biggest, most well-known commercial commissions kind of happen around this time as well. Right before she passes, she is commissioned by the United States Postal Service to create the love stamp. And it sold over 700 million copies. It's one of the things that so small that you don't even think about it sometimes, that it's just infiltrated into your like pop culture, the language, visual language. So it's one of their best-selling stamps. And when they go to release it, to have the party, they do it on the set, or at the studio set of The Love Boat. And Corita refuses to go because she was like, I anticipated this at like the UN or something along those lines. Like when when she speaks of love and when she references love, it's a humanitarian love. It's a love for each other. And so actually one of the last works she creates before she passes is called Love is Hard Work. It's kind of like a reaction to and making very clear where she stands in thinking about our responsibility as individuals. And just because, we are speaking today and this is what's happening in the world, I've been very much thinking about a speech she gives towards the end of her life. It's in Cambridge, and she speaks against war and anti-nuclear war. And I don't want to butcher it, but the last paragraph is something that I've come back to often, essentially calling for a new type of community. And if we create it, then we are artists. And if we don't, it means the end. So what matters except to be artists? And that in her later years was really the center of so much of her work and her life, and her energy was spent towards that. And when she passed, she left some of her papers to Harvard. She left a considerable amount of work to the Grunwald collection that is now at the Hammer Museum. And then everything else came to the Immaculate Heart community, which we're still a part of, we're a project of. So when we think of her legacy, I think that that's really fascinating, is that these were the women that were essentially once in habit with her, that there was a mass exodus from the church, and they created a nonprofit. And so they just celebrated their 50-year anniversary. They've been quietly saving hospitals, opening schools, you name it. And so she entrusted her estate to them, and they formed the Corita Art Center in 97, which is, they're primarily a group of women that said, you're not going to forget her, right? This matters too much. And so that's how the Corita Art Center was formed, with how can we use this incredible legacy that she left us to inspire the next generation, to keep these conversations going and create new opportunities for artist educators.
And she spent last years of her life in Boston, right? So she moved away from LA. But essentially, the legacy kind of stuck with LA very much.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Speaking of which, well, first of all, I will make sure that I will include in the adjacent blog post all the references and as many pictures as possible, especially the work that we were talking about, that you mentioned by name, so people will actually have an opportunity to look and study the work of Corita. But now we are hopefully at the very end of the pandemic. I know that you guys were closed for almost 2 years and operating mostly online. And yeah, I will include the link. Everybody should subscribe to your newsletter. Absolutely. But what is happening with the Corita Art Center right now? Are you going to reopen? Are you opening up for public? Are you accepting visitors by appointment? So how is that going to work going forward?
Oh, thank you for asking. I jokingly kept referring to the Friends episode where they've got that couch and they keep trying to get it up the stairs and they're just yelling pivot. I'm pretty sure that's what it's been for years. Right now we're prioritizing researchers, because there's a backlog of researchers who've been waiting to come into the archives, and we'll be taking appointments. It's not going to be likely the same as it was before. We're a little constrained, and suddenly you realize how small of a space you operate in. But with that, we have been spending the last few years as an opportunity in working in digitization and making this as accessible as possible. When we started our application for her studio during the pandemic, we didn't have access to her archives. And this really kind of shone a light on a larger soapbox, if you will, of mine, of how are we digitizing and making available women's history online, because it really is quite important to be able to go to historical accolades of the people that have come before us, specifically women's history and women's art history. So we've been focusing on that. We have a lot of programming. We've been doing, you name it, please come join the mailing list. And we do hope to be doing in-person programming again at some point this year, with our hearts full of optimism that we can see people again. There's such energy given. But that said, I don't know what the hybrid will look like. we now have a community that is global. The people attend our Zoom, programs from all over. And I certainly wouldn't want to close the door to a wider community. So we've been thinking through what it could be to have the best of both worlds moving forward, and keep sharing Corita as accessible, make her as accessible as possible, and this work.
Well, Nellie, thank you so much for this. This was an incredible interview. I feel like, reading about Corita is one thing, but talking to someone who is so close to her work and so passionate about her legacy, it's a very enriching experience. I have not been to Corita Art Center myself because when I was doing the work, it was right at the beginning of pandemic, and I didn't have a chance, unfortunately. But I'm very much following all your emails and your Instagram, and I am personally pleased and proud. I don't know why I'm proud, but I am that you're keeping Corita's message, and you're keeping her art, and you're making it as accessible as possible, because I feel like we're lacking this in today's world. We really do. And also, as we're speaking more and more about women artists and the legacy of women, and Corita was very influential as an artist, as a person, as a social activist. She should not be forgotten. She should not be put in a drawer. And especially people in the US, let's start with California. We all should know about her. She's incredible. She's absolutely incredible. So with that said, I really appreciate you coming on today. And I will leave all the information in the blog post, how to find you, how to find Corita Art Center, all the online programs, the photographs, the link to subscribe to your newsletter. And everybody, please give Corita Art Center a follow on Instagram, blow them up, show them love.
Thank you. We feel it.
Well, thank you very much. We're at the top of the hour. I think, that's a good point to say goodbye. And I am really happy we got to meet, and I'm really happy that you accepted my invitation. And I hope to see you again very soon in the art scene. It has been another episode of In the Art Scene podcast. If you liked today's conversation, please give us a good review on Apple, and go listen to other great stories. Check out our website intheartscene.com, or follow us on Instagram at intheartscene for more content. If you are a creative and you want to share your story, shoot us a message from the website or DM us on Instagram. Look forward to seeing you next time in the art scene.